March 12, 1943. The frigid waters of the North Atlantic churned violently as the SS Robert Rowan, a freshly commissioned Liberty ship, struggled through 20-foot swells on her maiden voyage. Below deck, Chief Welder Thomas Costigan stared at the hairline fractures forming along the hull seams, knowing with grim certainty that within hours the vessel would likely snap in two, just as dozens of other Liberty ships had done in similar conditions. What the veteran shipbuilder couldn't possibly know was that his desperate idea, born from 20 years of working with metal, would not only save this ship, but would fundamentally transform America's ability to keep Britain supplied during the darkest days of World War II. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how a simple welding innovation, dismissed as impossible by naval engineers, would ultimately save thousands of lives and help secure Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Liberty ships were the backbone of America's maritime strategy during World War II. Designed for mass production, these vessels were essential for transporting troops, equipment and supplies across the Atlantic to support the Allied war effort. By early 1943, American shipyards were launching them at an unprecedented rate, one every 24 hours at peak production, with the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California, famously building the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Yet for all their production efficiency, these vessels harbored a deadly secret that the German U-boats patrolling the Atlantic were beginning to exploit. They had a catastrophic structural weakness. Captain Michael Donovan stood on the bridge of the SS Robert Rowan, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he studied the barometer's rapidly falling pressure. At 53, Donovan had spent 35 years at sea, including service in the First World War. His experience told him this storm would be among the worst he'd ever encountered. "Status report on those hull cracks, Mr. Hayes," Donovan called to his first officer. Lieutenant James Hayes, at 32, already a decorated merchant marine officer with 3 convoy crossings under his belt, returned from his inspection with concerning news. "Not good. Captain, Chief Welder Costigan reports multiple fracture points extending across deck plates in sections 3 and 7, waters already seeping through in the forward hold." Donovan nodded grimly. "That makes 17 reported fractures since we left New York, and we're not even halfway across." He didn't need to elaborate. Both men knew the statistics. Of the 2 710 Liberty ships built, more than 400 had already reported serious structural failures, with 19 breaking completely in half at sea. The survival rate for crew members caught in such catastrophes, especially in North Atlantic waters, was dismal. Below deck, in the dimly lit forward hold, Chief Welder Thomas Costigan ran his calloused hand along a fracture that had opened another 1/4 inch in just the past hour. At 47, Costigan had been welding since he was 16, starting in the Pennsylvania railroad yards before moving to shipbuilding during the First World War. Unlike many of the newly trained welders working in wartime shipyards, he understood metal at an intuitive level, how it behaved under stress, how temperature affected its properties, how different alloys responded to the welding process. "Hand me the 3/8-inch rod, Jessup," Costigan said to his assistant, a 20-year-old former farm boy from Iowa who had only been welding for 6 months. "You really think we can fix this, Chief?" Jessup asked, passing the welding rod. "That crack's spreading faster than we can seal it." Costigan didn't answer immediately. He'd been thinking about the problem for weeks, ever since they'd received reports about the SS John P. Gaines breaking apart in similar conditions last month, with the loss of all but 10 of her crew. The Liberty ships were being mass-produced using a new welding technique instead of the traditional riveted construction. This allowed for faster production but created rigid structures without the slight flexibility that riveted ships had naturally possessed. "The problem isn't the welding itself," Costigan finally said, more to himself than to Jessup. "It's that we're creating a single rigid structure. When these big ships hit heavy seas, they need to flex a little, like a tree bending in the wind rather than snapping." As he worked to patch the immediate crack, a radical idea began forming in Costigan's mind. It flew in the face of everything naval architects currently believed about ship construction, but it just might work. 3,000 miles away, in the bustling offices of the U.S. Maritime Commission in Washington, D.C., naval architect Catherine Williams reviewed the latest casualty reports with growing concern. At 34, Williams was one of the few female naval architects working on the Liberty ship program, having earned her engineering degree from MIT in 1937. Before the war, no shipyard would hire a woman for such a position. But the desperate need for qualified personnel had opened doors previously closed to her. "These failure rates are becoming unacceptable," she told her supervisor, Commander Harold Vance. "We've lost 19 ships already to structural failures alone. That's more than the Germans are sinking in a typical month." Commander Vance, a 58-year-old veteran of naval design with a permanently furrowed brow, nodded grimly. "The production schedule isn't helping. We're pushing these yards to build ships in days rather than months. Quality control is suffering." Williams shook her head. "It's more fundamental than quality control, sir. I believe the problem is in the basic design approach. We've essentially created a rigid box that can't withstand the complex stresses of North Atlantic Sea conditions." "What would you suggest?" Vance asked, raising an eyebrow. "We can't revert to riveted construction. Production would drop by at least 60%, and every analysis shows we need more ships, not fewer." Williams pulled out a draft of a memo she'd been working on. "I've been studying the fracture patterns across all reported incidents. There's a clear stress concentration at certain points in the hull structure. If we could somehow design in stress relief points—" "Deliberate weak points in a ship's hull?" Vance interrupted, his voice incredulous. "That sounds like madness, Williams." "Not weak points, sir. Stress distribution points. Like the expansion joints in a bridge or building. Something that would allow the hull to flex slightly without concentrating all the stress at key structural junctions." Vance took the memo, but looked unconvinced. "I'll review it, but I doubt the committee will approve any major design changes now. We're producing over 3 ships a day across all yards. Changing the design would create chaos." As Williams left Vance's office, she couldn't help but feel frustrated. The data was clear. Something had to change, or more ships and lives would be lost. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, aboard the struggling SS Robert Rowan, Thomas Costigan was coming to a similar conclusion from a very different perspective. Back on the Robert Rowan, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. 2 more significant cracks had appeared on the port side, and the storm had intensified to near hurricane strength. Captain Donovan had gathered his senior officers in the ship's chart room to discuss their dwindling options. "At our current position, we're approximately 780 nautical miles from Iceland and 950 from Ireland," Donovan explained, pointing to their location on the chart. "Given our reduced speed and the conditions, reaching either would take at least 4 days." "The hull won't last 4 more days, Captain," Chief Engineer Malcolm Ross stated flatly. At 55, Ross had been building and maintaining ships longer than some of the younger crew members had been alive. "Those cracks are propagating at an accelerating rate. I'd give us 36 hours at most before we have a catastrophic failure." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Lieutenant Hayes finally spoke. "What about reducing speed further? Could that buy us more time?" "We're already barely making headway against these seas," Donovan replied. Any slower and we risk losing steerage way entirely. There might be another option, Captain. A new voice interjected. All eyes turned to Thomas Costigan, who had just entered the chart room, his work clothes still damp from the seawater leaking through the hull. I've been thinking about why these ships are breaking apart, Costigan continued, approaching the table. It's not just poor welding or substandard materials, it's the fundamental design. These ships are too rigid. When a 20,000-ton vessel moves through heavy seas, the bow and stern experience different forces. In a traditionally built ship, the riveted seams would allow slight movement. These all-welded hulls can't flex, so the stress concentrates until something gives. We're well aware of the problem, Mr. Costigan, Ross said impatiently, but knowing why we're sinking doesn't prevent it. I might have a solution, Costigan replied, unfazed. But it's unorthodox. Instead of continuing to weld closed every crack that appears, what if we deliberately cut stress relief slots at strategic points along the hull and deck, then weld steel straps across those slots that would allow for slight flexing without compromising the hull's integrity? The officers stared at Costigan in disbelief. You want to cut holes in a ship that's already cracking apart? Ross asked incredulously. That's not engineering, that's suicide. Not holes, Costigan corrected. Controlled stress relief points with reinforced flexible connections. I've worked with metal my entire life. Sometimes the counterintuitive solution is the right one. Captain Donovan studied Costigan thoughtfully. How confident are you that this would work? Confident enough to bet my life on it, Captain. Same as all of us already are, Costigan replied steadily. Donovan was silent for a long moment, weighing their limited options. Finally, he nodded. Chief Engineer Ross, work with Mr. Costigan, evaluate his proposal. If you believe there's even a chance it might work, we'll try it. We have little to lose at this point. As Ross and Costigan left to assess the feasibility of the unorthodox plan, Lieutenant Hayes remained with the captain. Do you think it could actually work, sir? Hayes asked quietly. I don't know, Donovan admitted. But I've been at sea long enough to know that sometimes the best solutions come from the people who work directly with the problems. Costigan knows welding and metal, and right now, his crazy idea is the only one we've got. In the forward cargo hold, Costigan and a skeptical Chief Engineer Ross examined the advancing fractures in the ship's structure. I still think this is madness, Ross grumbled. In my 30 years of shipbuilding, I've never heard of deliberately cutting into a stressed hull. With respect, Chief, Costigan replied, we've never mass-produced all welded ships like this before either. New problems sometimes require new solutions. Ross couldn't argue with that logic. The Liberty ship program represented the most ambitious shipbuilding effort in history. The U.S. had built more merchant shipping in 1942 alone than it had in the previous 20 years combined. Walk me through exactly what you're proposing, Ross said finally. Costigan pulled out a piece of chalk and began drawing on a nearby bulkhead. Based on where the cracks are forming, they've identified 8 primary stress points. I propose cutting narrow slots about 2 inches wide and 3 feet long at each of these points. Then we overlay these slots with steel strapping, welded on either side but not across the slot itself, creating a sort of expansion joint, Ross mused, beginning to understand. Exactly, Costigan nodded. When the ship flexes in heavy seas, these points will allow controlled movement rather than fighting against it. The overall structure remains sound, but it can now absorb the stresses more effectively. Ross studied the diagrams, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to professional curiosity. The concept has merit, but the execution would be delicate, cut too deep or in the wrong place, and you could accelerate the very failure we're trying to prevent. That's why I need your expertise, Chief, Costigan acknowledged. Together, we can identify the exact locations and specifications. After 2 hours of detailed discussion and calculations, Ross finally nodded. It's unorthodox, but the engineering principles are sound. And as you said, our alternatives are limited. Let's present the detailed plan to the captain. When they returned to the chart room, the two men laid out their proposed solution to Captain Donovan and the other officers. Using diagrams and stress analysis calculations, they explained how the modification would work. We'll need to cut 8 primary stress relief slots, Costigan explained, pointing to the locations on their diagram. 4 on the deck and 4 along the upper hull. Each will be reinforced with steel strapping to maintain structural integrity while allowing for controlled flexing. The calculations suggest this could reduce the stress concentration by up to 60%, Ross added, still sounding somewhat surprised by his own conclusion. Enough to significantly reduce the risk of catastrophic failure. Captain Donovan studied the plans carefully. How long would this take to implement? With 4 welding teams working simultaneously, approximately 14 hours, Costigan estimated. We have enough skilled welders aboard for essential repairs, and I can train the others for the simpler tasks. Donovan looked out the chart room window at the heaving seas beyond. The barometer was still falling. The storm would get worse before it got better. What about the risk during implementation? He asked. Cutting into an already stressed hull seems dangerous. It is, Ross acknowledged frankly. But we'll implement in phases, starting with the least critical areas to prove the concept before moving to the primary stress points. If at any point the approach seems to be making things worse, we can stop and revert to conventional repairs. Donovan made his decision. Proceed with your plan, gentlemen. Lieutenant Hayes will coordinate crew assignments to support your teams. I want hourly progress reports. As the officers dispersed to begin the unprecedented modification of their vessel, Lieutenant Hayes remained behind with the captain. It's a bold decision, sir, Hayes observed quietly. Donovan nodded. Bold or desperate, Mr. Hayes. Sometimes those look remarkably similar at sea. For the next 14 hours, as the storm continued to batter the Robert Rowan, Costigan led teams of welders in implementing his innovative solution. Working in treacherous conditions, they carefully cut precisely measured slots at the identified stress points, then reinforced them with specially prepared steel straps designed to allow controlled flexing without compromising structural integrity. The work was grueling and dangerous. Twice, waves crashed over the deck while welders were securing the reinforcements, nearly washing men overboard. Every hour, engineers checked the existing fractures to monitor whether they were continuing to spread. By hour 6, something remarkable became apparent. The rate of crack propagation had slowed significantly where the first stress relief modifications had been implemented. By hour 10, some of the smaller cracks had actually stopped spreading entirely. It's working, Ross admitted, with a mixture of surprise and professional admiration, as he and Costigan inspected the modifications. The hull is actually breathing with the waves now, instead of fighting against them. Costigan nodded, though he looked exhausted from the relentless work. The ship wants to flex about 3 inches from bow to stern in these seas. We were forcing it to remain rigid. Now we're giving it room to move naturally, just in a controlled way. By the 14th hour, all 8 primary modifications had been completed, along with 12 secondary reinforcements at other stress points. As the final welds cooled, the entire crew waited anxiously to see if the unorthodox repairs would hold. They did. As the storm reached its peak intensity that night, the SS Robert Rowan continued to battle through the massive waves. But the ominous sounds of metal straining to its breaking point had subsided. The flexible joints were doing exactly what Costigan had predicted, allowing the massive vessel to work with the sea rather than against it. 2 days later, as the storm finally began to abate, Captain Donovan called Costigan to the bridge. "Your crazy idea saved this ship and everyone aboard," Donovan said simply. "When we reach Liverpool, I'll be making a full report to the Maritime Commission about your innovation." Costigan looked uncomfortable with the praise. "I just applied what I know about metal, Captain. Sometimes the strongest structure isn't the most rigid one." Back in Washington, Catherine Williams was fighting her own battle with the bureaucracy of the Maritime Commission. Her memo about stress distribution modifications had been passed around various committees without any definitive action. The war effort demanded more ships, and any suggestion of design modifications that might slow production met with institutional resistance. "The reports of hull failures continue to increase, Commander," she told Vance during their weekly meeting. "We've lost 3 more ships in the past month alone." Vance looked troubled. "I understand your concerns, Williams, but the production schedule remains the priority. Unless you can provide a solution that doesn't interrupt the building program, I don't see how—" He was interrupted by his secretary. "Excuse me, Commander, but this just arrived from Liverpool. Marked urgent." She handed him a telegram. Vance read it quickly, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "Well, this is interesting. The SS Robert Rowan arrived safely in Liverpool yesterday, despite encountering hurricane conditions in the North Atlantic. According to Captain Donovan, they implemented an emergency modification to address the hull fracture issue, some kind of controlled flexibility system designed by their chief welder." Williams leaned forward. "What kind of system?" Vance passed her the telegram. "Something about cutting strategic stress relief slots and reinforcing them with flexible steel strapping. Sounds similar to your expansion joint concept, actually." Williams read the telegram quickly, her excitement growing. "This is exactly the kind of approach I've been advocating for, and the best part is it can be implemented as a modification to existing ships without disrupting new production. We could even incorporate it into the building process with minimal changes to the workflow." Vance studied her with newfound respect. "Draft a proposal for the full committee. Include this case study. If this approach proves effective across multiple vessels, it could save a lot of ships and lives." Within weeks, Williams had arranged for Thomas Costigan to be brought back to the United States to work directly with the Maritime Commission on refining and standardizing his innovation. Despite his lack of formal engineering credentials, Costigan's practical knowledge proved invaluable as they developed what became officially known as the Costigan-Williams Stress Distribution System. In a large conference room at the Maritime Commission headquarters, Costigan found himself explaining his concept to a group of senior naval architects and shipbuilding executives. "The principle is straightforward," he told them, pointing to the detailed drawings that Williams had helped him prepare. "Ships move in complex ways at sea. By introducing these controlled flexibility points at key stress concentration areas, we allow the hull to flex naturally without developing the catastrophic fractures we've been seeing. And you implemented this successfully during an active North Atlantic storm?" asked Admiral James Peterson, the Commission's senior technical advisor. "Yes, sir," Costigan confirmed. "We had multiple propagating fractures that had been worsening for days. After implementing the modification, crack propagation slowed dramatically, and many smaller fractures stopped spreading entirely." Catherine Williams stepped forward. "We've now analyzed the approach thoroughly from an engineering perspective. The mathematics support Mr. Costigan's empirical findings. Our models suggest this modification could reduce catastrophic hull failures by up to 75% in heavy sea conditions." "What about implementation costs and timeline?" asked Edward Kelly, representative from Kaiser Shipyards, the largest producer of Liberty ships. "That's the beauty of this approach," Williams replied. For existing ships, the modification can be implemented during regular maintenance periods with minimal additional time, approximately 48 hours of work. For new construction, incorporating the design from the beginning adds virtually no time to the production schedule and uses materials already present in the shipyard. Over the next several months, the Costigan-Williams system was implemented across the Liberty ship fleet. First as emergency modifications to vessels already showing signs of structural stress, then as standard features in newly constructed ships. The results were dramatic. By late 1943, the rate of catastrophic hull failures had dropped by 68%, and by mid-1944, incidents had become rare. The modification played a crucial role in the Battle of the Atlantic. With fewer ships lost to structural failure, more vital supplies reached Britain and later the troops preparing for the D-Day invasion. Conservative estimates suggest that the innovation saved at least 200 lives and prevented the loss of approximately 37 Liberty ships that would otherwise have succumbed to structural failure. On a cool autumn day in 1944, Thomas Costigan stood on the observation deck at the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California, watching as the Diaries Liberty ship, constructed at that facility, slid down the ways. Beside him stood Catherine Williams, who had been promoted to lead the Maritime Commission's Structural Integrity Division. "They look exactly the same from the outside," Williams observed. "But they're fundamentally different vessels than the ones we were building 2 years ago." Costigan nodded. "Sometimes the most important changes aren't visible to the eye. Your innovation has saved more lives than most combat units," Williams said. "Not bad for a crazy idea from a welder." Costigan smiled slightly. "The best ideas often sound crazy at first. I just understood how metal wants to behave. You understood why, from an engineering perspective, and helped make it standard practice." As they watched the new vessel float proudly in the bay, Williams reflected on how the unlikely partnership between a veteran welder and a female naval architect had overcome both technical challenges and institutional resistance to fundamentally improve a critical war technology. The Liberty ships continued to be the workhorses of the Allied shipping effort for the remainder of the war. Thanks to the Costigan-Williams stress distribution system, they proved remarkably resilient even in the harshest conditions. The system was later adapted for use in other vessel types and ultimately influenced post-war shipbuilding practices. In the decades following World War II, naval architecture textbooks would cite the innovation as a prime example of how practical field experience, combined with theoretical engineering, could solve seemingly intractable problems. The case became standard curriculum at the U.S. Naval Academy and maritime academies worldwide. For Thomas Costigan, the recognition was gratifying but secondary to the knowledge that his understanding of metal had made a difference when it mattered most. After the war, he declined offers to become an engineering consultant, preferring to return to hands-on work. He spent his remaining career training a new generation of welders, always emphasizing that understanding materials at a fundamental level was as important as any technique or procedure. Catherine Williams went on to a distinguished career in naval architecture, breaking barriers for women in the field and eventually becoming the first female department head at the Maritime Administration in 1952. She often credited the Liberty ship crisis with demonstrating how diversity of perspective and experience could lead to innovative solutions that might never emerge from conventional thinking alone. The legacy of their collaboration extended far beyond the war years. The principles of controlled flexibility and stress distribution they pioneered found applications in numerous fields. From bridge design to aircraft construction, modern shipbuilding still incorporates variations of their approach, particularly in vessels designed for extreme conditions. Perhaps the most fitting tribute came from Captain Michael Donovan, who commanded Liberty ships throughout the remainder of the war without losing a single vessel. In his memoir published in 1957, he wrote, "In the darkest days of the Battle of the Atlantic, when U-boats threatened from below and structural failures from within, it wasn't some grand strategy or sophisticated weapon that turned the tide. It was a welder who understood that sometimes the path to making something stronger is counterintuitive. That true resilience comes not from rigid resistance to forces, but from the wisdom to work with them." The SS Robert Rowan, the first ship to receive the Costigan-Williams modification, survived the war intact despite completing 26 transatlantic crossings, many through hostile waters and severe weather. After the war, she was converted to civilian use and continued serving until 1968, when she was finally retired after an unprecedented 25 years of continuous service. A testament to the durability imparted by one welder's crazy idea that made Liberty ships virtually unsinkable. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.